Before Caitlin and Justin sit down to present today, though, I do have just a few quick announcements, so please bear with me. First one's first, if you have one of these, please do take the time to silence it right now. Also, while you have that phone out, if you do decide to take photographs and share them on social media, please remember to tag both Caitlin and the Library Shop SD. My name is AC, and I work for the Library Shop. I'm here today to make sure that you leave with a copy of Caitlin's book, but during the week, I do work for a wonderful organization that also advocates on behalf of the San Diego Public Library System called the Library Foundation SD. Arguably, one of the most beautiful library systems and one of the largest in California, the San Diego Public Library is unfortunately also one of the most chronically underfunded libraries in the state, with just $2.80 allocated to books and materials per capita. That wouldn't even buy you a tenth of today's book. So if you'd like to read more than a tenth of a book, I hope you'll keep in touch with us. This is in comparison to some other municipal branches with much lower populations, by the way. The San Francisco Public Library allocates over $20 to books and materials per capita. That's nearly 10 times what our library system can offer to our patrons, even though San Diego has a population of over 500,000 more people. We want to change that. You may have heard recently that the library's budget has been cut even further, forcing all branches to close on Sundays and the majority of our 37 branches to close on Mondays. This means drastically reduced access for residents, but it could have been worse. Readers like you in San Diego helped us to fight these budget cuts by joining direct action, leaving public comments, writing postcards, and showing up at hearings alongside the Library Foundation. My colleagues and I are continuing to fight for a fairer budget for the San Diego Public Library, and we will not stop until we reach 37/7. That's all 37 branch libraries open and available to the public 7 days a week. If you want to join us in that and stay informed of opportunities to support the library, please come connect with me in the back after the event, and I can get you connected with us so that we can keep you posted on what's happening in the San Diego Public Library. Also, come visit me if you don't have your copy of Down to the Bone yet, or if you want to read Justin's work. I have copies of those books available for purchase, and proceeds from the sales of these 2 books today go to support the San Diego Public Library System, as did your purchase before you came, so thank you so much for supporting libraries. If you'd like to come to some other events, we've just scheduled, but haven't announced to the public yet, an event at Pacific Highlands Ranch with investigative reporter Emily Baker White, one of the journalists who broke the story of TikTok using phone location data to try to intimidate sources and stifle investigations of the company. Her book about TikTok's misdeeds, called Every Screen on the Planet, comes out this fall. Join our mailing list so that you don't miss the announcement for this and other exciting presentation. On to today's amazing authors. Here in conversation with Caitlin, we are very excited to welcome criminal defense lawyer, USD law professor, and founding director of the California Innocence Project, Justin Brooks. This talented legal mind is the author of the only casebook devoted to the topic of wrongful convictions, and his extraordinary work on an early case with the California Innocence Project was portrayed by Academy Award-nominated actor Greg Kinnear in the feature film Brian Banks in 2019. If you do get a chance to chat with him tonight, ask him about that work. In 2024, Professor Brooks was awarded the Oatley Award for his efforts launching innocence advocacy organizations in Latin America. He is the author of You Might Go to Prison, Even Though You're Innocent. Please give a round of applause to Justin. Now, our author of the day today, Caitlin Rother, is a New York Times bestselling true crime writer and award-winning journalist. She worked for 2 decades as an investigative reporter and has been published in Cosmopolitan, the Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Union Tribune, the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and others. As a crime commentator, you may have seen her on TV. She has done over 200 media appearances on episodes of 2020, People Magazine Investigates, Crime Watch Daily, Australia's World News, Nancy Grace, Snapped, and many, many more. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading her earlier book, she also has a selection of those available here today. Please take a look as you get your book signed. Caitlin also works as a writing and research consultant. She plays piano and sings in an acoustic band. In fact, she comes to us very fresh from some recent singing performances at the Killer Nashville Writers Conference. Please give a warm round of applause to welcome Caitlin Rother.
Killer National Writers Conference.
Killer Nashville.
Ah, okay. Yes.
Killer Nashville.
Killer Nashville, and it's mostly for crime writers.
Okay.
So it was fun. They are my people. I found my people. It's hard to find them.
Well, thank you so much for writing this book. I really enjoyed it. It was
Thank you.
incredibly detailed, really an impressive level of detail, and I guess as a lawyer, I saw an impressive amount of objectivity, which I'm not used to reading when I read detailed things about crimes. So why don't we start? This is a true crime book. Let's start with the crime. Give maybe a thumbnail sketch of this crime and the McStay family and what happened.
So we didn't know it was a crime at first. The McStay family, if you remember from reading the newspaper, which is how I found about it, they were a family of 4. They lived in Fallbrook, California. They had been living in San Clemente for a number of years. They bought a house out in Fallbrook in foreclosure with the idea of doing a bunch of remodeling, making some money, selling it, and hopefully being able to move back to the coast. So Joseph McStay is the father, Summer McStay was the mom, and they had two young boys, 3 and 4 years old, Gianni and Joey Jr. And so the way that Joseph McStay, is that a brother named Michael? Joseph McStay made his money was selling waterfalls online through a website. And he started out his business some years earlier. He did go bankrupt when he got divorced, things fell apart. He rebuilt it, improved the website, and basically was selling these mostly retail, going through other manufacturers and reselling them on his website. So he wasn't really making that much money. But right before this family disappeared, in February of 2010, he was planning to expand his business with one of his 2 primary business associates, which we'll get into in a minute, to basically do more custom work and make more money and sell them through his website and be able to keep more of the profits. So at the time that they disappeared, he had big projects pending, and so it was very unusual for him to just kind of go off the grid. So February 4th was the last time that anybody had seen or spoken to him of 2010. And basically both of his business associates were trying to reach him. His family, his mom, his brother, his dad who lived in Texas, they were in pretty regular contact, but they weren't answering the phone and they weren't answering emails. So there was red flag, basically what's going on. Charles Chase Merritt was the guy who manufactured the the waterfalls for him, and Dan Kavanaugh, these are the 2 business associates, he was the one who designed the website to sell the waterfalls. They both were contacting family members. Dan Kavanaugh also contacted the sheriff's department to get a welfare check, so they were the ones who seemed most concerned since they were working with the McStays, with Joseph McStay on a day-to-day basis.
So when you say disappeared and they do a welfare check, it's not like they weren't answering their phones and all of a sudden the family was gone, so maybe they took a vacation. What did they find when the police actually looked into the family?
Well, they weren't sure where they went, and they thought maybe they did go on a vacation, because apparently one other time they had gone someplace and didn't tell anybody. So the family wasn't initially that concerned. It seemed like the business associates were more concerned than the family members, which is why it took 11 days before Michael McStay was persuaded to report them officially as missing. But before that, he and Chase Merritt climbed through a back window and came inside, and what they saw was fresh eggs sitting out on the counter, as if somebody had been cooking. There was, plates, half-eaten plates of food. There were a couple of bowls of popcorn on a futon where the 2 boys would snack, coffee in the pot. The 2 dogs that were normally kept inside were both in the backyard without any food or water, which was really unusual, as if, they had just left all of a sudden, abruptly. They were also in the middle of painting the kitchen, and so the drawers were out, the cabinets were off, there was blue paint, newspaper on the floor, and there was a paint tray with a roller in it, and it had been left wet, so nobody cleaned up. So it looked literally like time had stopped.
And so now it's 11 days later. What do the police do?
So Michael McStay finally calls up the sheriff's department and reports him missing, and so he goes to the sheriff's office and fills out a report. While they're at the sheriff's station, the deputy looks up online to see, what's going on with their cars, because there was a green Dodge that was in the driveway. He found out that their white Isuzu Trooper had been towed from a shopping mall in San Ysidro, within walking distance from the border. And so they went over to the house and they did a walkthrough, and they basically saw the eggs, saw the coffee, saw diapers in the kitchen waste bin, all that kind of stuff. So it didn't smell really good. It had been freshly painted, so it was still lots of weird smells. And they noticed, this is sort of strange, that it looked like they left suddenly. They couldn't find anything in the house, like brochures for a vacation or whatever. They had no telltale signs of where they had gone, and also no real signs of foul play. So the deputy thankfully took like 5 photos upstairs and downstairs, and if he hadn't done that, we would have lost all track of what had actually happened, which we'll get to in a minute.
What did the deputy, though, secure everything in the house? Because I found that interesting in the book.
Yeah.
Some of the things they were allowing them to do while it's a potential homicide scene.
So the deputy took those pictures. He called for the homicide unit, because the homicide unit at the San Diego Sheriff's Department also investigates missing persons cases. They do not have a separate unit for that. So it had been, after 10 days, a missing person does end up getting reported to homicide if they want them to. And in this case, he said, yeah, let's do that. So then they called in the homicide unit. The detective walked through the house and basically just looking to see if there was anybody in the house. So, and then they interviewed Michael McStay, who was the brother who reported the missing, and another set of detectives interviewed Joseph's mother, who drove down from Oxnard. They did not secure the scene, and they did not tell Joseph's mother or brother that they were coming back to serve a search warrant, which turned out to be a pretty bad mistake.
And things ended up actually leaving the house during this period of time as well.
So Michael McStay testified later that he had been given permission to take a computer, and he took some cameras and some video cards and stuff because he wanted to build a website because his brother was missing. He testified that he had permission. The detective was like, no, you never had permission. So it's kind of unclear, but there was a conversation, because I have the interview transcript, where basically Michael McStay is kind of worried about what's going on, and could he be, in trouble, and because the detective was asking, where is Summer from? And oh, well, she's Colombian. So in the detective's mind, immediately that's drugs, right? Okay, so if she's Colombian, that must mean there's some kind of cartel or something connection. And so Michael McStay was like, well, what do you mean? Do I need to worry? And anyway, they basically said, if you have any access to his financial records, that would be helpful. So I think, playing devil's advocate, maybe Michael McStay thought, if I look through his computer, maybe I can find something to help. So he took a computer, he took some stuff. The next morning, Susan McStay came in and cleaned up the whole kitchen. So, because nobody told her, we think maybe a murder had occurred here, and she didn't seem to think there was a murder. So according to the detective, he didn't want to freak out the families, so he didn't tell them that he was going to file for a search warrant, stating that he thought that there had been foul play and potentially a murder here. So she cleaned up everything. So when the detectives came back 4 days later, everything had changed. So, that's not a good thing.
So I've had experience doing homicide cases in San Bernardino, and in one of my cases, it was without a doubt the worst crime scene preservation I'd ever seen. Officers walked all over the scenes, touched everything, contaminated. They even left the body in front of the house overnight. Dogs started to bury the body while the police were on the scene. And then we had dog bite marks on the body. We were trying to discern from human bite marks. It was just shocking how poor.
Well, I wanted to just briefly bring up Death on Ocean Boulevard, the Rebecca Zahau case, if you remember that one. Same sheriff's department, Same homicide unit. They left Rebecca's house body out in the sun, naked all day long, and in the sun in Coronado. So news helicopters were flying over, could see the naked body. People in the other houses over 2 stories could see her naked body. I mean, very disrespectful.
I think the most powerful part of the book, for me, who's read a lot of homicide stuff, still was fairly shocking, was ultimately the discovery of the family. So describe that.
Okay, so this is how the book opens. I actually kind of have 2 openings. So the prologue takes place 4 years later. So the Sheriff's Department of San Diego County investigated this case as a missing persons case for 3 years. The detective basically decided that they went voluntarily to Mexico and gave up. And he thought that partially because he had some volunteers looking through footage at the pedestrian crossing into Tijuana, and they found some grainy footage of what looked like possibly 2 adults and 2 children wearing beanie caps, which this family, Joseph and his 2 sons wore because Joey Jr. had a strawberry birthmark that Summer wanted him not to feel self-conscious about, so all the men in the family were wearing beanie caps a lot of the time. They were seen crossing the border. And so he kind of just decided, I think in the back of his mind, he's still thinking the drug thing, even though Summer was not Colombian, she was Mexican. And there was no evidence of any drugs in the house, except for some ecstasy that they found in the freezer that Joseph had, which he apparently used to sell when he was a teenager. Anyway, so he basically, the detective said, I don't have any more leads. 3 years later, I think they went voluntarily to Mexico. So I'm handing this case over to the FBI, which never really happened. 8 or 9 months later, there was a motorcyclist out in the desert just off-roading off the 15 near Victorville, and he saw this bone sitting on a rock. And he pulled over and he looked at it. It was a white bone, and he thought, I wonder if this is human. And it was basically a child's, this portion of the face, so it was a piece of the skull. So he called 911, and they came out, and they're like, yeah, that does look human. They called out an archaeologist, and they eventually did a grid search of the entire area, and they found 2 shallow graves, 20 feet apart, about 18 inches deep. And each grave site, which was basically like a sunken area, like they had dug the dirt out and then dumped it back in, and you could still see it even 4 years later. There were also tire tracks leading one to each grave site, and each tire track had a different wheelbase diameter. And I'm bringing this up now, we'll get more into this, but neither one of these wheelbase diameters matches the person who's owned a truck and is now on death row for murdering these people.
So they find the family there, the mother is actually separate, and there's evidence that she was also raped and murdered.
There's a theory. So there was an adult and child in each of the 2 graves. So Summer McStay was buried in what looked like a bathrobe, sweatpants, and panties, which were pulled off her body and were above her head, which is why they think maybe she was raped at the gravesite. Her bra was cut, like with a knife, down the center in the front, and they found it cut in the gravesite. Joseph's body was packaged differently. He was like enveloped in a kind of a burlap material, and then there were cords and ties wrapped around the body. So he was actually enclosed in some other material, and she was not. So it looks like they potentially were separated and brought to the gravesite separately, because it just seems kind of strange that they would not be packaged the same way.
So now we have a murder case.
Right.
And you have to read the entire book to truly get a grasp of the suspects in this case. But can you, simple as you can, you've referred to 2 business associates who
Right.
seem to be the main focus of the book.
Yes.
One is put on trial, one is not put on trial. Break those down into what will be their motive, opportunity, what evidence indicates one or the other could have been the killer.
Okay, so I mentioned Dan Kavanaugh was the guy who did the website. Chase Merritt is the guy who built the waterfalls. So about a year before the family disappeared, Chase Merritt and Joseph McStay had been working together on some more custom waterfalls. Initially, before Chase Merritt came onto the scene, Dan Kavanaugh rebuilt this whole website. He improved the SEOs so it moved up on in the search engines. And in his mind, I think he was responsible. Well, I don't think, I know he told this to the detectives. He was responsible for the success of this business, and in his mind, he was the reason why Joseph was making any money. Chase Merritt and Joseph McStay were getting to be good friends, and like I said, Joseph wanted to expand the business, do more custom work so he could make more money, but he was doing this separately with Chase Merritt without telling Dan Kavanaugh, and therefore was cutting Dan Kavanaugh out of those deals. So previously, Dan Kavanaugh had been getting some kind of percentage, I think, on each project. But in these ones, Chase Merritt and Joseph McStay were keeping a separate ledger in QuickBooks. So he had two separate QuickBooks accounts. And Dan Kavanaugh, even though he had access to the other one, he found out that there was this other set of projects because he was in the website and he saw an email come in and he started getting curious and he found out that they had been hiding these projects and he wasn't getting cut in. So a year before they disappeared, he sent a series of threatening text messages to Joseph that he was really pissed off and upset that this was going on, and if he didn't pay him off and cut him in, he was going to shut down the whole website. And so these are all in writing, by the way, and the detectives were given these messages and told about these threats, and they didn't really seem to think much about them. Also, right before they went missing, Dan Kavanaugh, for the first time, sent a message to one of Joseph's clients, sent him an invoice for something like $12,000, and asked to be paid directly to Dan's personal bank account or credit card or whatever it was, bank account, as payment for this project. Now, that had never happened before. Joseph McStay handled all of those kinds of things in the business, had never asked Dan to try to get any money. So, and this is before they even went missing. Also, right before they went missing and in the days before they were reported missing, Dan Kavanaugh started taking money from Joseph's bank account to pay himself for some small sums of money, something like, in the end, it was something like, I don't know, $9,000. But the point of it was, these are all things that he had never done before. And later on, the defense attorneys basically said, well, it seems like he knew they were going to go away or they weren't going to know what he was doing and wouldn't catch him. So there are these things that he's doing, and the sheriff's department was told about these various activities, and for some reason they just didn't think that it was anything wrong, because Dan Kavanaugh was being so cooperative and so helpful to the detectives that the detective, it seems, didn't even seem to realize that the information he was getting from Michael McStay and Joseph's mother was all coming from Dan Kavanaugh. So he thought he was getting fresh information when in fact Dan Kavanaugh was feeding these people information and it was coming back as if it was new information. So this detective, to me, was not very good at doing critical analysis. Chase Merritt, on the other hand, said that he had been working with Joseph McStay to separate this QuickBooks account so Dan couldn't get access to it. But he told the sheriff's department that he didn't want Summer to get access to it initially, which raised some questions. But he was also taking money. He was using the QuickBooks account to print out checks for himself to pay, which is typical, that he was getting paid up front to go buy materials so he could build these projects. It just that he hadn't done it through the QuickBooks account before. And he told the sheriff's department later that he and Joseph had planned to do this as all part of this whole thing about moving away and expanding and expanding the business to more custom projects and not including Dan Kavanaugh in that, bringing the IT in-house. So there was obviously some power struggles going on, and there were some funky things, and those checks were ultimately a big part of what the prosecution's case against Chase Merritt was based on.
So that's something I didn't get from the book, because I think you rightly didn't take a position on much. I mean,
Yeah.
you really are reporting like a reporter on the case. Actually, I'll take that back. You're reporting like an old school reporter.
Right.
If it was a reporter today, you'd have an opinion about everything. But, so why do you think ultimately the police went after Merritt? Was it just as simple as that, as he said a couple of things that weren't accurate?
Well, the one thing that troubled me the most about this is that, and this was the defense's case when it went to trial, there was a second sheriff's department that investigated this, and they pretty much set their sights on Chase Merritt almost within a couple of 3 months. And again, never looked at Dan Kavanaugh, and that's what really bothered me, and that's what the defense argued. They clearly both had the same possible motive financially. During the trial also, Dan Kavanaugh ended up taking over the business. He said, hey, I'm a partner, I'm gonna help the family run it, pushed Merritt out, and so Merritt wasn't making any money at all and ended up, that was his only source of income. So Dan Kavanaugh basically took over the business and eventually sold the business and never gave the McStay family any money. And so he basically was taking in, they did an analysis, one expert they hired took in $206,000 over a 10-month period, and $59,000 of that went toward fountains, versus $20,000 in these checks that Chase Merritt was accused of stealing, when in fact some of that money he even paid to another vendor, so it wasn't even a full 20. So that's 10 times the amount. So actually Dan Kavanaugh had, according to the money, just looking just at the math, 10 times the amount in terms of motive. And they never even considered him a suspect. That's my main concern.
Do you think there's possibly a third theory to this too? I mean, all through the book I was thinking, because I've looked at thousands of homicide cases, I've never seen as brutal a homicide case over a business deal where you slaughter 2 young children and you describe how the sledgehammer was used to smash their skulls. And I'm just thinking, if this was a business motivation, what would bring this person to slaughter this entire family?
Well, and the other troubling thing to me is Chase Merritt had been in prison before, but only for receiving stolen property, never anything violent. And I think it's odd for somebody who's 58 years old and has never hurt anybody, has a family of his own, 3 kids, including a small boy, would suddenly take a sledgehammer and hit a 3 and 4-year-old in the back of the skull over $20,000. It just doesn't make sense. And so I don't know who killed this family, honestly. I'm not sure it's not an either or between Dan Kavanaugh and Chase Merritt. I'm not sure it was either one of them. And there was the defense said at one point, there was actually a Mexican cartel who was using a sledgehammer to kill people. I mean, it sounds more like that to me.
Yes.
Right?
In fact, it does.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to the trial then, because
Okay.
you referred to the defense a couple of times.
Yeah.
Tell us about this wild trial that's well documented in your book.
Well, okay, so there's a million flaws with both investigations. Obviously, the San Diego Sheriff's Department didn't do a full job and thought, the whole time I think that detective was just kind of sending it in, oh, they went to Mexico, there's some kind of drug thing we don't know about. San Bernardino County, they spent their whole time trying to find forensic evidence to back up their premise that they thought he did it. Now, Chase Merritt, early on, because I have all the investigative reports, so I know what they were thinking when. And I just want to be clear that these are not public documents. You cannot do a public records request and get these discovery materials. You have to get them from somebody who's a party to the case. And I didn't get them until 4 months before my deadline. I had to basically rewrite my entire book. This is after working on it for 12 years. But that's how I know these things, and this is how I know what they were looking at and who they were looking at, and who they were not looking at. And San Bernardino did not even interview Dan Kavanaugh until a month before they arrested Chase Merritt. And it was because they were just trying to dot their I's and cross their T's and just say, we just need to make sure that this is the guy. And yet, in their search warrant affidavits, they were still saying in writing that they didn't have enough evidence to arrest anybody. And that's a month before they arrested Chase Merritt. So it's just, there's a lot of conflicts in terms of professionally of how this whole thing was conducted. And then once it gets to trial, the prosecutors are picking and choosing what the investigators found and changed some of the theories. So because some of the evidence doesn't make sense. So I want to give just a couple examples of that. So a lot of this case is built on that $20,000 in the checks that they said he stole from the QuickBooks account. There was also a bunch of cell tower records that they used to claim that Chase Merritt was, based on where his phone was, that he was cleaning, that he murdered this family the day that he and Joseph McStay had lunch on February 4th in Rancho Cucamonga, which is a good hour and a half from Fallbrook. So they tracked, using cell phone records, they tracked Joseph's phone, and they saw him driving up to Rancho Cucamonga, calling Chase Merritt, having lunch with him because the phone was an hour and a half in Rancho Cucamonga, and then driving back to Fallbrook and calling Chase Merritt. Coming back to the house, Joseph McStay called Chase Merritt at 7:47. That was the last time he called anybody on his phone, and it was to Chase Merritt. Chase didn't answer the phone. Some surveillance video from across the street, a neighbor had a camera, saw a white truck going down the street, and they decided initially, San Diego Sheriff's Department thought that was that white Isuzu that they had towed from the mall in San Ysidro. The San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department decided that was Merritt's truck. So the prosecution was trying to prove that. So they hired this expert who basically was told to do some kind of measurements using this video and match them up against the truck. So there's pieces of metal that are going to reflect at night with the red lights, the white lights on the truck, and put them against this video. Is that Merritt's truck? He said, no, it can't be Merritt's truck, because if it were Merritt's truck, the wheels would have to be underground. Okay, well, we're just going to have to fire you then because you're not agreeing with our premise. Let's go find another expert who will say that it was Merritt's truck, and that's what they did. So that was kind of what the trial was about. The cell phone towers information, they said, okay, well, Merritt was in the house killing this family, and that's his truck at 7:47, except they also knew and ignored the fact that somebody was on Joseph McStay's computer at 8 p.m., 15 minutes later, working on a CAD program on a plumbing issue that they had been talking on the phone all day long about for a waterfall. So if they were killed and he had driven them away in that truck, then who was on Joseph's computer 15 minutes later? And these are the kinds of things that were presented at trial, and the jury didn't seem to either take notes, or they overlooked it, or they didn't notice. I'm not really sure. But there are these discrepancies and these conflicts that I picked up for sure. The other thing was there was faulty logic in terms of, okay, so Merritt had his phone off for 14 hours at a time while he was busy cleaning up the blood. That, by the way, they never found a single speck of blood in that house. And if you know anything about head injuries, with the sledgehammer, that blood would have gone everywhere, splattered everywhere. Did not find a single drop of blood. And yet, when he was supposedly burying those bodies with a truck that doesn't match any of the wheelbases, he was supposedly leaving his phone on so that it could pick up, the signal. Does that make sense? Would you leave your phone off while you're killing people, but you're going to leave it on while you're burying the bodies? Anyway, those are just a few of the conflicts in the prosecution during the trial. I don't know what else you want to ask me about the trial.
I don't know. It seemed to me, and you read the transcripts, but it seemed those salient points that you just made, which should have been the core, I think, of the defense and the closing. But it went on for, was it 60 days that this trial was?
6 months.
Yeah, so you have a 6-month trial. There seemed to be arguments every day between the prosecution and defense. This was under the reign of Ramos, which I've had a lot of experience with him. So it seemed to I think it got lost in all of that, perhaps, that there were these very salient points that could establish innocence.
Right.
That by the point the jury finally is considering it, there's just so much nonsense going on that got lost in it.
Well, and a couple more things. The cell phone tower stuff can get super tedious, but I mean, I learned a lot writing these kind of books that, you know, I would never kill somebody and get caught because I know exactly what not to do.
Or your cell phone.
Yeah, well, the thing is that people think, well, if I turn my cell phone off, then they won't know where I am. But they notice that you turned your cell phone off, you know, so you can't really get away with that.
You leave your cell phone on a train going north.
Yeah, well, they've started learning, if you just watch TV, you can see that people, you know, smash them or they toss them into someone else's car going in the opposite direction, right? So basically, though, the cell phone tower information was super tedious and technical, and then there was also the DNA testimony, and I think these were two areas that were actually really important that I think the jury might have just glossed over. So just briefly, there were 3 DNA profiles found that the defense found. They tested these items where they thought the killers might have touched. So the ties around Joseph's body, so the knots, that's where, same thing with the Rebecca Zahau case when she had supposedly tied herself up. They test the knots because that's where the person tying the knots would have touched. They found 3 DNA profiles on the 2 bodies and the items in the graves and outside the graves, and 2 men and 1 woman, and none of them matched Chase Merritt. And none of them matched the McStays, except that to this day, those DNA profiles have not been run through the federal CODIS database to try to get a match to see maybe who was the killer. And that really bothered me as well. But the prosecution basically just dismissed all of that during trial by tone of voice, by sarcasm, by calling it junk science because it's a probabilistic genotype. And they had several witnesses up there describing for the jury what that all meant. And it's not specifically DNA, it's like an algorithm and it's more complicated. And so what you do is you run it through the CODIS database and you see if you can find a match, and then you get that person to submit their DNA, and then you try to do a direct match, and then that's how you find out. So the probabilistic genotype is just a way to get there. But they've never run that through the database. The judge wouldn't allow it because, we'd have to have a whole hearing and that'll delay the trial yet another month. And to this day, it's still never been run through the database.
Well, to give you a sense of how San Bernardino sees DNA, in the Bill Richards case that we did, they actually contested whether DNA was a valid science at all. So we had to have a hearing on whether DNA was a valid science. We had 48 hours there, about 10 cameras watching this hearing on whether DNA was a valid science. I remember saying to the DA, have you thought about what happens if you win today? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, I'm going to send this ruling out to every public defender's office in the country. You'll reverse 10,000 cases of DNA, because 1,000 people are convicted on DNA for every 1 person who's exonerated on DNA. And yet San Bernardino at that period of time, and then in that same hearing, when we actually got to the end, the judge said he was going to wait 30 days to give a ruling. And because the DA got up and again said DNA was voodoo science, the judge said, I'm ruling right now in favor of the defense. So they took that position fairly consistently. And it's just, I don't know what it is. It's just another way. It's just kind of kitchen sink approach to trying a case. And it blows up in their face a lot.
Well, there actually is another vendor that does a similar type of technology that San Bernardino uses, and so that's not junk science as long as they're hiring that vendor. But this other one that does the same thing, and in fact, one of the companies sued the other because the technology was so similar. So how does that work?
Yeah.
You know?
And also on the data bank issue, access to DNA databanks has been something annoying me for 20 years because prosecutors can't get instant access to them and run them. But once somebody's convicted, you have no right on the defense side. And they put up these arguments like privacy arguments saying, well, you're getting access to private information. And I always say, we're gonna have the judge order that they run it through the data bank. The judge will get the information back. If it's relevant information to the defense, it now becomes Brady material, it has to be turned over. But that's another thing that when these data banks came around, that since they've started, they've fought vigorously to keep them out of access to the defense.
Well, and in this case, the prosecution accused the defense of not asking for this DNA information to be run through the database. And then, but the defense says, but we don't have access to it, that only the prosecution has access to it. And like you said, the judge is the only one that can order them to do it, and the judge refused to do that because he said, we're gonna lose jurors and we're gonna have a mistrial. Isn't it better to kind of find out what really the truth is?
That should be grounds for mistrial itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what else about the trial? I was fascinated by the trial part of this because it seemed like daily arguments and
constant. It was the judge basically likened the two sides to just school children bickering in the yard, and he goes, you know, the defense kept saying prosecutorial misconduct, which might have been true, but the judge would never take it to the next step. The prosecution would say, I demand a hearing. You're accusing me of misconduct. I demand a hearing. There was never a hearing. So they just kept arguing. It was so tedious. I literally had to only mention it in the book a few times because it would have annoyed the readers too much, but they were just constantly bickering and accusing each other of, you know, ethical impropriety. And the thing was, though, at times, I think the prosecution really was misrepresenting information. I mean, I saw many examples of it, and I didn't want to get sued, so I had to be careful what I did with the book. Seriously, really careful, because I don't need a judge. You know, one of the prosecutors ended up being elected. This is funny. One of the defense attorneys ran against one of the prosecutors in this case for a judge's seat, and the prosecutor, who I thought was the most egregious of all of them, of misrepresenting and twisting the evidence in her own statements, to the point where I was just kind of shocked, honestly. She's the one who won as a judge.
But that's such an important point, because I think when I'm reading your book and seeing all these defense attorney and prosecutors arguing with each other, and I say this to my law students all the time, I say, when you're a defense attorney, you walk into court, don't think you're ahead because they've got to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. You are down 2 touchdowns with 2 minutes to go, is the reality. So I think a San Bernardino jury seeing the defense making noise, the prosecution making noise, I think ultimately it hurt the defense, and will typically hurt the defense.
And because San Bernardino County is a very conservative county that actually wanted to secede from California because they were so conservative, they are ranked, I think, 4th in all of the 58 counties in terms of how many defendants they send to death row. So if you were accused and you're in a death penalty case in San Bernardino, good luck.
And I think when the defense is making all these arguments, the way the jury can see it is they're trying to obstruct the truth from coming out.
Yeah.
When the prosecution's complaining, they're complaining about the defense's conduct, but they're not seeing it that way. And so I think it's hard, and I think we as defense attorneys get lost in that sometimes and don't see truly the way the jury is seeing us, because we see ourselves as the good guys.
And the judge kept saying, you know, to the defense, look, I know you're complaining about the prosecution, but one of the defense attorneys and this judge had just been through a corruption trial in which the person who was accused actually was acquitted. And the judge said, look, just think about the last case we were in together. The jury doesn't like this kind of behavior by the attorneys, and it will actually go back against the ones who are the most egregiously misbehaving. And so he basically just said, hands off, I'm not going to pursue this. I'll leave it to another court to deal with this. Which again is completely abdicating his responsibility. I mean, if you're a judge, you're supposed to be keeping order, and he basically just threw up his hands.
I can see it. All right, should we open it up to questions?
Okay.
Oh, a lot of hands out.
Of all the cases that you've written about and investigated, what has been the most impactful, or just what has been one of the most impactful?
It's unbelievable.
The most impactful case that you've
All the
investigated?
cases?
Of all the cases that you've been involved in and written about?
What do you mean by impactful?
Well, that really hit you hard, or just you found challenging?
All the books. I mean, I pick them. There are a lot of murder cases to choose from, and most of them are not worth a book. So in order for me to pick one to write a book about, it has to hit me. So, and I try to pick something different for each book so that I don't write about the same kind of case or allegations or whatever. So This one, I still kind of have PTSD from, because like I said, I didn't get the discovery materials. And let me just go over that for a second, just so you get the idea. Thousands and thousands of pages on a hard drive, and some of the PDFs would have to keep reloading and break down every time I was trying to go through them. So it was incredibly hard to, and I had to process all this information. I had already written a book. I'd written 90,000 words. And I ended up writing 60,000 more words based on everything I was pulling out of these documents. So there were witness interviews that the detectives had done, and not every single one, but many, and all the investigative reports that all the detectives had written. And what I noticed was that the detective in San Diego County did a number of interviews that were written up after the bodies were found, which meant he never even bothered to write them up because he didn't think they mattered. And they were about Dan Kavanaugh and all these accusations about him and what he was doing, and you know, it just didn't seem to matter to him. I can't prove that he had anything to do with the murders, and that's pretty much what the judge said too. So by the time the defense tried to, they wanted to do what's known as a third-party culpability case, blaming Dan Kavanaugh and not Chase Merritt, and the judge said, no, you don't have enough evidence. So the defense basically did everything they could to point the finger, at least financially, that Dan Kavanaugh had at least the same motive, to just try to show some of the things that I told you. This case bothers me more than probably any case that I've written about for these reasons, because normally, you know, I have to pick a case that's already reached some kind of resolution in court. So a jury has to convict somebody for me to get a deal with a publisher, because you can't just accuse somebody who's never been a suspect or never been arrested of murder. So in the case of Death on Ocean Boulevard, this is the Rebecca Zahow case. There never was a criminal case, because the sheriff's department decided that Rebecca Zahow tied herself up, bound and gagged herself, and threw herself magically off a balcony by leaving a couple toe prints and knowing exactly how much rope to cut so that she would fall 9 feet and 2 inches without touching the ground. And the lividity pattern in her body, which is where the blood settles with gravity, if she had been hanging for hours like she supposedly was, according to her boyfriend's brother, the lividity should have been in her feet, right? Gravity should be in her feet. But where was it? It was horizontal. She was on the ground, on the grass, when the police arrived, when Adam Shacknai called 911, and the lividity was all across where she was lying on the grass. So was she ever hanging? We don't know. But they decided within 4 days, based on the investigative reports that I got access to in that case as well, they decided that it was suicide. So I forget what your question was.
That was another impactful.
That bothered me too.
I'll make one quick comment about third-party culpability first, because it's one of the most misunderstood principles of criminal law. I'm a criminal law professor, so I need to mention it. And it's what my wife, who's sitting up front here, it drives her crazy watching any crime show with me, because they do this in movies and TV all the time. Just start pointing the finger. Maybe it was that guy. Maybe it was that guy. You cannot do that in the criminal legal system. You have to have a pretrial hearing, and you've got to establish there's enough evidence to point the finger at another suspect. Otherwise, that's what they do in every case. Just point to the 7,500 people who may be liable for it, may look the same, maybe whatever. But the problem with it on the flip side is, on the one side, society kind of needs that protection. On the other side, as a defense attorney, I don't have the ability to go out and do an investigation at the level the government does. I don't have police access, I don't have crime lab access, I don't know all these things that you need to build up a third-party culpability case enough to get over that. And that was a frustration reading your book, because I could see from the defense point of view, they got this really good suspect, this guy Kavanaugh. There's a lot of stuff pointing to him, just as much, quite frankly, as the person who gets to death row. And yet you can't bring it in, so then he's got to slide it in everywhere he can, and then that leads to the prosecution going crazy, and all the arguments in the courtroom. So I absolutely felt that frustration on behalf of the defense.
For Q&A, I'm going to ask that we stand up when called on and use our American Idol voices on the back of the today. So if you're not comfortable with that, I'll stop for you. Just let me know.
I'm curious why it was San Bernardino that where the trial happened. Was that because of where the bodies were found?
Yes.
Or?
And because San Bernardino Sheriff's Department was the one that investigated it as a homicide because that's where the bones were found. Yes.
You dropped the drug cartel bomb. Was there any evidence that was actually linking? Okay, that was just a.
Except for the manner of death. I mean, so that's, to me, pretty important. They found a 3-pound Stanley sledgehammer in one of the graves. No DNA on the sledgehammer, no blood on the sledgehammer. So maybe that wasn't the murder weapon. Yes.
Yeah, just as a base, I was an investigator for 40 years, so just to give a quick background. It always occurred to me that the one with the grudge, with the axe to grind should be one of the primary suspects, and I didn't notice any axe to grind. Particularly, the thing that occurred to me was the person who's getting the $20,000, and I'm thinking, wouldn't they be one of the primary ones to have an axe?
Well, Chase Merritt depended on Joseph McStay for his income, and the minute that this happened, he lost his business. So why kill the golden goose? I mean, that seems like a big question for me. Dan Kavanaugh, on the other hand, was the one making threats and the one threatening to shut down the business because he felt like he was being shut out, and Joseph McStay was moving in another direction to bring IT in-house. So in terms of having a grudge and being upset about being cut out for the past year out of those deals, to me, that would have been somebody to look at. And yet, they didn't look at him. And he claimed, I was a partner in this business. In fact, I'm the reason this business is a success. There's no piece of paper, there's no filing, no tax filing. In fact, the opposite. There was an email from Joseph to his accountant saying, I am a sole proprietor. I actually made a mistake and I checked the wrong box, but I am a sole proprietor. This is my business. There's nothing, and the detectives researched this with the state, and they knew that there was nothing proving that Dan Kavanaugh was a partner, and yet he took over the business and then sold it and kept all the money, and nothing ever happened to him. So I asked the prosecutor, and I asked the detective, why didn't anything ever happen to him, and why, because there was no victim. Joseph was dead. And even if he did steal money, if they could prove that he stole money, there's no victim, they can't prosecute him because Joseph is dead. So just a quick aside, I just got some Instagram message from somebody in Hawaii who said that she's reported Dan Kavanaugh to the federal and state authorities for harassing and trying to take money from her over some deal. And I was like, wow, okay, so he's still at it.
Weren't there also a bunch of people unhappy with their fountains?
There were some people who were unhappy with Chase Merritt's workmanship. Yes.
Well, there was some also when he said they didn't deliver the fountain.
Oh, you mean Dan Kavanaugh? After
Yeah,
he took
kind of the
over?
company in
Yes,
general.
yes. The Better Business Bureau had a bunch of complaints and, yeah. Other questions? Yes.
Mine was about the sledgehammer. Was that ever proven that was a murder weapon? Or did it just happen to be in the grave?
It was in the graves, and there were holes in the skull that were similar to the size of the end of the sledgehammer. So they said basically it's consistent with. They never usually know for sure that a murder weapon is is definitely the murder weapon. But that's the other thing. The way that it was written up in the reports. By the time it gets to trial, it's a sure thing, but if you go back and read what the medical examiner actually wrote, it's not a sure thing. Just like they said, oh, well, we connected Chase Merritt to this case through his DNA. Well, what's that? Well, he was a possible minor contributor on the steering wheel of the car that was towed from that lot, and he said he never drove it. Okay, so, how does that link him to the murder? Really, and that the minute they got that DNA that came back, and who was the major contributor? Joseph, which means he was probably the last person to drive the car, not Chase Merritt. And the way that the seat was positioned in the driver's seat, it was not somebody of his height, it was somebody who was shorter. So clearly Chase Merritt was not driving that car because the seat would have been in a different place. There are just so many things that just did not add up, including the murder weapon. Yes.
So the part that most confusing to me, 2 trucks, 2 different tire tracks, not matching anything. That would imply that there's 2 parties
Right,
involved. So it's not just
right.
one or the other, it's either both or it's another couple of parties. They had no investigation, nothing was ever found, couldn't prove what kind of vehicles.
And the prosecution's witness even said that the wheelbase of Merritt's truck was 71.5 inches, and everybody missed that. The ones that they measured from the Draves were 73 and 76, so it wasn't even his truck.
But was it 2 trucks?
2 trucks.
2 separate trucks,
Yes.
left tracks. at
Neither
the
one
first-
matched his.
Or at the burial site.
Yes.
And that's an example, I think, of what I was saying earlier, of I think that just the salient facts that got lost in a 6-month trial, and a jury that's worn out, and a lot of bickering, and a lot of that you have some definitive stuff like that alone could be reasonable doubt, but got lost.
I mean, I look for those things because I'm a reporter, I'm an investigator too. So, I mean, I've got a whole list of all the things that don't match. And that if I were on the jury, I would have been listening for those things and noticing those things. But, I had a question from an audience recently at an event, and they said, what do you think happened with the jury? And I said, I think they lacked critical analysis. Or they just glossed over some of this technical stuff. And because it was 6 months, that's including the death penalty portion of the trial. But what also happened, which we didn't mention, is that one of the defense attorneys came down with a neurological condition, and he was out for at least 6 weeks, sitting in a dark room, couldn't think. And he was the one who was supposed to call the cell phone tower expert, never did. So Chase Merritt is still angry about that to this day.
Never good when your defense attorney comes out with a neurological problem in your trial.
Exactly. Yeah.
A couple questions, but the first has to deal with, you've written a couple of books already on cases where the investigators are responsible for either not investigating or making mistakes. You've written a whole book on cases where people were wrongfully convicted and it's very difficult to get them out after even it's proven. Doesn't appear to be any accountability for these investigators. And is it because there isn't enough oversight in these agencies? I mean,
They got promoted.
Yeah, I mean, so.
Because they did such a great job, and because they got the verdict, the guilty verdict. So in their minds, they did a great job, and the department rewarded them. Because nobody's pointing this stuff out. And the press didn't have access to the materials that I did. And this is what's wrong with not having enough journalists. This is where we are, is things like this happen. There's all kinds of misbehavior going on that nobody's watching and nobody's catching because we don't have enough journalists, and the journalists who are there are not asking the right questions. So this is where we end up.
And my second question was, how did you get access to those?
I can't tell you.
On the post-conviction question, Caitlin asked me would I take in this case on post-conviction. And I think the hard thing is, when you read a case like this, and you're like, this trial seems to be a mess, there's a ton of stuff indicating another guy did it, there's a ton of stuff that indicates this guy didn't do it. In California at the time of this case had the worst new evidence standard in the nation. And I know this because I wrote a law review article and read every one of them. In California, once you're convicted, you have to have evidence that completely undermines the prosecution's case and points unerringly to innocence. And if you don't have that, you don't get your case reopened. Now, we got that changed in the legislature, and now you have to have evidence that if the jury had heard it, they would have never convicted the defendant to start with. And if you think through this case, it is a tough one because there's a lot of stuff that was brought up to the jury, but it sounds like they ignored it. And
There was also a lot of stuff that the jury was not allowed to hear that I think they should have heard, which we didn't even get to. The gun, Joseph McStay's gun. I wish I could talk more about it, but it would take another 10 minutes.
Yeah, post-conviction is a very different thing than trial. And that's why the hardest thing about doing innocence work is you're constantly turning people down who you believe very well might be innocent because you just know there's no court in California that's going to reverse that conviction.
When you do your research for all of your books, do you typically travel to the crime scene?
This was really far away, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to find it, and I had photos. So I think, and it's also been, this was 2010. I don't know what it would look like now. So it was better to look at the photos that were taken by the sheriff's department in my mind. But yeah, I mean, I like to go. I went to the house. I couldn't go inside because someone else owns the house, but usually, you know, in a case like this, there's been time, you know, with the death penalty case, it takes a long time to get to court. So yes, it's always good to go look at things, but things have changed, so I don't know how much really, it's better to read reports actually that describe it, I think. Cause I don't know what I can see now, so.
I know we've got a question waiting over here.
Hi. Is there a cure for a systemically broken judicial system? It seems so random and arbitrary, and as someone else has stated, there's no accountability. It's just, oops, you know, and how many people do you think, or have studies shown that are in prison as innocent people?
I have something in the back of the book. There's some statistics, I don't remember what they are, but prosecutorial malpractice, am I using the right, misconduct, sorry. Prosecutorial misconduct is rarely, they're rarely complained. So even though it came up constantly verbally in this case, there was never a hearing. There was never an official complaint filed, no matter how many times the defense brought it up. So, I mean, in order for a process to work, you have to use the process. And if you don't make an official complaint, there can't be a hearing. Do you see what I mean? So I think it's like rarely comes to fruition. You have to actually follow the process through. And I don't know the statistics based on if there's a hearing, then what happens. But that didn't happen in this case, where they kept threatening and it just never, I don't know if that's the judge's fault, or because the prosecutors were like, well, let's have a hearing. I want to have a hearing, because they don't want to be accused either. You know, they want to clear their names, but the defense never followed through, or the judge just ignored it. And so that's part of the problem, I think. You know, if you don't actually have a resolution to that, then there can't be any statistics because you never actually pushed it over the line.
Right.
It's very rare that it happens to either side, by the way,
Yeah.
to be fair. It's rare that defense attorneys, there's ever much consequence. I mean, I've seen some very bad defense attorneys as well. The one case that bothers me the most, where they really did discipline a prosecutor for their misconduct, was the Duke lacrosse case, if some of you remember that. And the reason that was so annoying was that I've had clients who've gone to prison for 20, 25 years due to prosecutorial misconduct, and nothing happens to the prosecutors. These kids, these lacrosse players at Duke, they're harassing this stripper at their party. There is a false accusation of rape, but they never go to prison. And, you know, it's a bad case, but that prosecutor got fired, disbarred, and those kids received millions of dollars in civil damages. And there's no way not to look at that and say these were mostly rich white kids from New York City who had a lot of power on their side, but that 99.9% of clients aren't in that position.
There's been quite a lot of activity up in the Orange County DA's office, where they've gotten in a lot of trouble, and the last DA ended up, you know, losing his seat because of the snitch controversy, where the sheriff's department was taping inmates getting information from other inmates and then giving it to the sheriff's department. I mean, it was a huge mess, and this was all brought to light by the public defender's office, and they've that actually has there's been quite a lot of accountability up there, but that's unusual.
I think maybe we can take one more over here, is that right, before we go to signing?
Okay.
It's a little past 3:30. Yeah?
We're good.
Oh.
I'm happy to answer questions a little more if
Take
people
one
have
or two
them.
more, and then we'll get some
Okay.
signing.
So my question, we've heard a lot of reasons to question the results of the trials. So along the lines of this one, what do you say to people who may struggle to have faith in the justice system?
Like I said, this case is the first one, really. Even my editor said, we've never published a book like this before. So generally my other books are much more cut and dry. There's a verdict and I write about it, and that's that. So this, in my experience, doesn't happen that often. This just seems bad in this case. But my other books, they're verdicts, and I just follow prosecution, and I'm not questioning it in the same way. I mean, there's one where the DA kind of had a bunch of internal in I'll Take Care of You. There was a bunch of squabbling between the prosecution and there was a female a female prosecutor that wasn't accepted or supported by the male Newport Police Department detectives, and so there was that issue, and these people went free because there was too much internal squabbling, but they ended up being arrested 15 years later, and it all worked out in the end. But I do definitely shine a light on that and show what happened, because it definitely screwed up the case, but in the end it was okay. So
I don't have confidence in the justice system at all. I literally, in my head, because I've seen so many innocent people go to prison, I have a plan for my first day in prison that I document in my book, which is I'm going to go on the yard and I'm going to get all the shot callers together, and I'm going to say, I'm going to be your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer, your lawyer. Keep all these dudes off me. I'll be in the library every day trying to get you out of here. My first plan will be a trolley to Tijuana and to cross the border, but that'll be my second strategy. If there's even any evidence that they could put on me. So I don't have confidence justice. I think that's okay. I think we need to fight to change it and make it better as much as we can. We have to follow it. It's what we have. But there's no way after 35 years of doing this work I can have a lot of confidence.
We've got another question here, I believe.
Thank you. You mentioned that there were 3 different DNA profiles found on the ropes. If those were to go through and actually get processed and there was a hit, would that be enough to get merit a hearing, or would the Innocence Project be able to pick it up, or what do you think would happen?
I think it would definitely make a difference, but the Sheriff's Department keeps insisting that they don't have the ability to do that, when in fact the testimony was that you have to just do it manually. You don't just do it the same way that you normally do it. There is a way to do it. They're purposely fighting that and claiming that they can't do it. So you end up with this morass of bureaucratic paralysis. And when Merritt later, after the conviction, tried to file something to see if he could get that somehow into the system, all there is a motion to have DNA tested, what's already been tested. So he's sort of stuck because there isn't a mechanism for him to get that done. And I don't know, maybe a habeas petition could get that done, but.
Maybe, but again, it'll depend on how much cooperation you get, because it is very hard to get that testing done to run it in the data bank. But in the Mike Hanline case, one of our clients that spent 36 years in prison, the longest in the history of California at that point, we did DNA testing on tape that had taped the victim's hands together, and that had been 36 years later, and we were able to establish our client's DNA wasn't on it and other DNA is on it. So, as usual, law is behind technology. Technology is always way ahead, but then you need all these procedures and processes to get things done, and it's not easy.
I want to make sure we didn't miss any. Can we do one more?
I just called this one, but I can come after, yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the Chula Vista case that's going to trial later this year? Maya Millett.
I'm actually thinking about going to that preliminary hearing.
I like to avoid every case.
That's the only one that I can see locally that I might be interested in. But they don't have a body, so we'll see.
I'm curious about a little bit more on your author side of things, like what makes you decide this case versus some other one, and then also like once you were interested in wanting to write this book, like are there other people pitching this same case to book publishers, and how do you get picked?
There are a number of my books where I was book number 2. So the first author probably worked for St. Martin's Press, which does books with maybe 5 pages of the trial. So the minute the verdict comes in, they'll go to press. But there's a ton of information that comes out of the trial that's not in that book. So it's kind of like one of those quick hits. But they take part of my market, which is really annoying. But I am the comprehensive person that steps back, waits till it's all over, and gives you the whole thing. So it's tough, but it's a tough market. It's a not a great market to make a lot of money, and it's shrinking, and the number of buyers are shrinking, the readers, because there's so much true crime on TV and so many podcasts. And they're not doing original work, they're basically reading the book and, talking about it. So I'm now starting to write thrillers.
Oh.
So this is a series that's starting in January. I'm gonna have 2 books coming out next year. This one is called Hooked. This was actually supposed to be Windansea because I have a surfing detective who surfs at Windansea, grew up in La Jolla, went to La Jolla High, and a female investigative reporter character. And so, I'm kind of tired of chasing these true crime cases because it's a lot of work. And this last one kind of gave me PTSD because I had to rewrite everything and cut in like 4 months, and it was exhausting.
And it was
So I'm
12
taking a
years.
break from the true crime and I'm moving into fiction. So I hope you guys will try the fiction too.
For sure.
Because it's all based on my experience and knowledge of true crime.
So before we transition to the signing, from both of you, I'd love to hear, for those who haven't finished it yet, as we sit down to read this book, what do you want us to be thinking of? Justin, if we can start with you, that way the author herself can finish this off. What do you want us to
I think, so it's hard for me to give anyone advice because doing 35 years of this work, I think I read the book a little differently than other people do. But I think the best way to read it is to open your mind and really try to assess this thing objectively because it's written that way in such a way that you can really feel the entire story from beginning to end. And I like that about it. It's something you probably wouldn't do with fiction. Because you don't wrap it up neatly, because it doesn't wrap up neatly. And so I think just going into it, we're all biased. We're going to bring our whole life of bias to reading anything, but try to keep your mind as open as you can.
I go into these stories with an open mind. And I don't go in saying, oh, this person is innocent or oh, this person is guilty. In fact, I just try to see where the evidence takes me and where the investigations, where the trial, what do I hear, how are people acting. I'm just basically sucking in information and from as many different sources as possible, and then I weave it all together. And I do it without putting my opinion in it, and I do it without taking a perspective. In my last 2 books, Death on Ocean Boulevard as well, people were frustrated. Some people are frustrated because I don't give you a resolution. I'm not telling you what to think. I think there are problems with both the suicide theory and the murder theory, honestly, because they didn't do a proper investigation and we don't have enough of the questions answered. I feel the same way in this case. There's still so many unanswered questions and so many conflicts in the evidence that, I don't know who killed these people. So I'm basically presenting, illustrating, I'm showing, not telling you what to think. I'm letting you come to your own decision, and so that's what I want you to do, is tell me what you think when you're done reading it. What do you think happened? Did they get the right guy or not?
All right. Did you want to tell us a little bit about these?
Okay, I'm going to do this real quickly, but I know I have a lot of books, so if I do them all, it'll take forever. If you're interested in fiction, Naked Addiction is my only mystery. It is the prequel to this new series, and it takes place in La Jolla. So it took me 17 years to get this book published. It took me another 17 years to get this book published. So those 2, if you like fiction. The rest are all nonfiction. So quickly, this is another one of my new books. It came out in February. This is an updated edition from a book that I wrote in 2009. If you like serial killer books, this one is for you. It's about Wayne Adam Ford. He was a long-haul trucker. He raped and killed 4 women. And the reason I updated this book is because they finally identified his first victim through genetic genealogy 25 years later. So now her family has closure. Her name is Carrie Ann Cummings. He picked her up in Eureka, California, and he ended up raping and killing her and then dismembering her, which is why we didn't know who she was, because they didn't have her head. If you just like short stories, this is my last one. I've got a collection of 10 murder stories out of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, including the Dylan Roof case, including the Pee Wee Herman case. He was a serial killer as well. The same guy who represented Alex Murdaugh just wrote a book about Pee Wee Herman, so I blurbed it for him. So this book was really very difficult as well. This book took a couple years of research went through the original source materials, which were very difficult to get from the LA County DA's office, read all the trial transcripts, went through the original court records up in LA in the basement of the courthouse, and got a bunch of information from parole hearings by all the family members who were still in prison, who were actually telling the truth and giving new information about what actually happened, including Tex. I got access also to Tex Watson's psychiatric records, which gives you a whole different perspective on what happened at the Tate house, where he stabbed all those people. I talked a little bit already about the Rebecca Zahau case. I look at this as part one and Down to the Bone as part two. They both deal with the same homicide unit in the sheriff's department here in San Diego County and how they handle cases, the flaws in both investigations, and that there were confirmation bias allegations, which basically, in both cases, which basically means that they have a premise or a theory or piece of evidence, they will not let go of it no matter what evidence they find to the contrary. Dead Reckoning, this case, and I'll Take Care of You, both involve the Newport Beach Police Department. Two murders. One was the murder of Bill McLaughlin he was a multimillionaire who invented a device that separates plasma from blood. He had a girlfriend who was a con woman. This woman is a piece of work. If you like stories about women who are con women, this was pretty good. She just basically didn't want to be herself. She had all kinds of cosmetic surgery. She pretended to be this rich man, and she would go to the gym and pick up these athlete men and go sleep with them, including Eric Naposki, who was an NFL football player. She told him that she had been raped by her boss, who was this multimillionaire who actually she was engaged to. But she would take off her engagement ring before going to the gym. And she ended up getting this guy to shoot Bill McLaughlin because she thought she was going to end up getting access to all of his money. The other case, you may have heard of this one. This is the Skylar DeLeon transgender killer who killed Tom and Jackie Hawks, the couple from Newport Beach who were tied to the anchor of their boat and thrown overboard. This was on 2020, and I was interviewed. I must have been on like 25 shows on this one. This is my New York Times bestseller, which is not a true crime book. This is about another NFL football player who fell down in the bathroom and hit his head and lost his entire long-term memory within a couple hours, didn't know who he was, didn't remember anything, and basically had to rebuild his life through his wife and by watching Fox News in the middle of the night. This is not a very long read, but it is my mini memoir about my marriage to an alcoholic who was the chief investment officer for the county pension fund. And it was actually something that I managed to finish writing after I watched the trial, the civil trial in the Rebecca Zahau case, because he hung himself as well. So I had a particular insight into this case because I actually lived with someone who killed himself by hanging, which was what the sheriff's department claimed. Poison Love is my very first book about the Kristen Rossum case, if you remember the really pretty toxicologist who was accused of sprinkling red rose petals, staging a suicide scene over her husband after killing him with fentanyl, which at the time was not available as it is now. There were a ton of TV things on that too.
I think you're going to sleep better reading fiction.
That's actually true. I'll Take Care of You. I covered Eric Naposki, Nanette Johnston. They did eventually get convicted. Then No One Can Have Her is a case out of Prescott, Arizona. Another super messy bunch of people, investigators and prosecutors and defense attorneys. Allegations going in every direction about impropriety and being unethical and flawed investigation up the wazoo. It was a mess, but this is a pretty interesting case as well. And then this is actually an updated version, but not as updated as this one, so it's half the price. And so just brought that just in case you wanted a cheaper book. Anyway,
I'm embarrassed to say I just have one book back there. You might go to prison even though you're innocent. That covers.
Were you ever involved that guys were what to do on your first day though?
I've got that in there. I've got a lot of strategy for surviving prison, as well as documenting the last 35 years I've worked on innocence cases. I've got a new book coming out soon with my son, my co-author's right here, Zach Brooks, about the true cost of justice, it's called. We're going to get into a lot of stuff the Trump administration is currently doing. So we'll come back for that.
That's gonna be a long book.
Do you have any lost girls up there?
I don't, because I don't have very many left, and I charge a lot of money for them as a collector's item. That's the John Gardner, Chelsea King, Amber Dubois case. If you are willing to get it as a collector's item, see me afterwards, but I can mail it to you, but I charge more money for
Well, I
it.
have it.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. You
Sell
can
it.
also get it by email or audio, which is regular price.
So I'm gonna ask you to please stay seated for a second while I do some flight attendance things, but first, big round of applause.
All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of community care. First, I have to get a photo of these two smiling because it is very hard to smile when you're talking about the subject matter. As I'm doing that, I'm gonna ask for a little generosity here. We did have an extended Q&A. If you are not in a rush, but you do wanna get your book signed, maybe stay seated for a second. Well, those who have a little bit more of an urgent need, you can start lining up over here. Oh, thanks, I'll keep that. Okay, you can start lining up behind the bench over here and then